In the 1960s, Diana Baumrin published her groundbreaking work on parenting. In the brewing cultural scene of Berkeley, California, her team interviewed and observed over 100 parents of white middle-class preschoolers. They found that children whose parents were authoritative, supportive, yet firm, had better social and emotional outcomes. Later researchers studying adolescents found that the same parenting predicted less drug use and delinquency. But in the 50 years since this work appeared, both the world of adolescence and our understanding of that world have changed. Teens are digital natives, never having known a world without internet and cell phones. They are targeted consumers, having more disposable income and freedom to purchase than ever before. In the face of such change, do classic theories of parenting adolescents still apply? Or do they need to be modified, updated, or even replaced? In this video, you will hear from leading scholars who worked together for 2 years to address this question. Trainees at the Center for Developmental Science in North Carolina followed their work closely and asked each of them to talk about their own research, to talk about what are unique aspects of adolescence today, and to suggest future research that's needed to get us there. How does your research help promote healthy youth outcomes?
So I'm going to focus in particular on this special issue in this paper, and it was through conversations with Andrea as well as some of my students where we really started thinking about that there wasn't enough work on how parents socialize their kids around class or social status. And I actually think that is important and maybe particularly timely with what is going on in the country right now, quite frankly, in terms of class relations, in terms of race relations. And so hopefully this paper and this talk and my work more generally will help us to start to think about how parents talk to their kids about what it means to be of a certain social class and the implications of that for their health and well-being as well as other people's health and well-being.
I primarily study the development of adolescents growing up in rural communities and with a focus on southern rural communities. And in the context of that, the overlay of my work really recognizes the influence of historical context and how it continues to impact how these parents raise their children in the rural South, particularly examining the role of the vestiges of slavery, Jim Crow, and how it evokes the continued social stratification of families around economic issues. And then in the context of that, my work focuses on then how do parents, despite this oppressive situation, raise healthy children? So what are the strengths of these families and how are they able to draw on those strengths in order to be able to raise really positive, healthy, functioning children? And so in the context of that, I view my work as having given a voice to families that are often invisible in our literature on parenting. Much of the way that we're training our students and what they're reading is primarily based on urban African American families and convenient samples of time going into clinics or public housing and studying these families. But these are families that live their natural setting in their communities is where my work takes place. And we have the voices of positive strength-based patterns that are happening in these families, which I think is really important because it's that kind of information that allows us to develop preventive interventions, which is where my work has transformed into now, looking at ways in which the empirical findings from our research have identified malleable targets that we can include in preventive interventions, and then test the theory of change by exposing families to this particular treatment randomized trial.
Beautiful. Wow, that's a deep question. I don't know. I think my goal of what I've been really trying to do is to just really try to understand the nuances of within group differences and what are sort of ways in which risk and resilience come together. I've been particularly as a clinical psychologist interested in understanding how these then play out in treatment or access to care. And so one thing that has been really important to me is to engage in work in sort of more intervention or prevention kinds of contexts that I think has the ability to inform sort of our theory, but also to really understand fully when we talk about these ideas in sort of our ivory tower, what does this look like in a real lived life experience? So my goal in terms of, I don't know if it is impacting the field, but I hope to impact people that we engage in our research studies with by sort of providing them sort of the tools that they need to sort of help their kids succeed and develop. We've done some interventions around engaging in mental health settings that I think is really important, and really helping families feel like experts in their families and their children and their worldview and in their perspective. And when they seek mental health counseling, that they're looking for someone to sort of help with that, but that fits into their worldview. So I think for me, that's sort of how do you blend things that may not be specific for a cultural group to a cultural group and have that be effective in that context, I think is a really important piece. And I think that's something that I've been just thinking a lot about and hoping that my work can speak to.
I do think that the work that we're doing now, which focuses on digital communications between parents and their adolescent or young adult children, does have some implications because it's really not something that we know very much about. As interventionists or parents even, there's a lot of question around what are the appropriate levels of technology use for kids, but then also how should parents be using that as a tool. So I'm really hoping that through empirical work, we can get some numbers around that and be able to make solid, empirically valid recommendations for how parents can engage with their kids. And if there is a level of over-involvement that's maybe not as helpful, we could get an idea of what that is. Because right now it's pretty anecdotal. And I think that this understanding of technology in adolescence is pretty driven by fear. So parents have a lot of worries around like what their kids might get into and what the media has shown them as risks. And some of that might, in fact, bear out in the data, but we don't know yet. And so I hope that we can maybe get a better empirical estimate of what is a healthy amount of technology use and different types of technology use that might be more helpful, and how parents can maybe leverage those technologies in ways that help their parenting.
So I lead a study called Parenting Across Cultures that is a study of parents and children and adolescents development in 9 countries. The countries are China, Colombia, Italy, Jordan, Kenya, the Philippines, Thailand, Sweden, and the United States. And we're looking at 13 cultural groups within those 9 countries. And I think that this is an important direction for the field because of the 1.2 billion adolescents in the world today, 90% of them are in low and middle income countries. And the vast majority of developmental research on parenting and adolescent development has been conducted in high-income countries. And the issues facing parents and adolescents in high-income countries may, in part, be the same as those facing parents and adolescents in low- and middle-income countries, but not necessarily. And so I think one of the things that my research attempts to do is to figure out what about theories of parenting and adolescence are cross-culturally generalizable versus culture-specific, and empirically, where do the findings show cross-cultural similarities versus differences. And so in some ways, when you think about what the challenges are that face parents in a high-income country versus a low- and middle-income country, they may be the same. But there are many low-income countries, for example, that are also facing armed conflict. And so if you're thinking about parenting an adolescent in that situation, that's a very different set of issues. 25% of girls under the age of 18 globally are married, and that's as high as 45% in South Asia. So there, if you're thinking about something like parental control, which is one of the things that I study, the issue may be very different if you're thinking about parental control, meaning you get to go out on the weekend with your friends to do something fun or not, versus I need to keep you safe so that you're not recruited to be a soldier in this fight that's going on in the country, or the control is the decision about whether you get to stay in school or whether you get married when you're 16. they're very different issues potentially that parents are facing depending on the broader societal contexts in which adolescents are situated. So those are some of the issues that I'm hoping to address with my work that's international in scope. And then in terms of implications practically for adolescent well-being, there are a few of those too. The United Nations Sustainable Development Goals are now guiding the international agenda from 2015 now through 2030. And so a lot of countries are using those Sustainable Development Goals as a way to frame lots of policy decisions and programs that are typically following policies. And 69 targets derived for 17 goals focus specifically on young people. And these are in a range of areas, from gender equity kinds of issues to health, physical and mental health kinds of issues, education access sorts of things. And so I think one of the practical implications of doing international research on parenting and adolescence is to try to inform what are ways to measure the kinds of targets that are goals of change in the Sustainable Development Goals, and figuring out ways to intervene or promote positive adolescent development in this global context.
My work is really focused on increasing cultural competence and navigating tough cultural conversations. So I spend time with parents and teachers and oftentimes with students, middle school and high school students and college students, talking about race, class, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, religion, socioeconomic status. How do we have these conversations around difference? And that is a way in which I think the work that I do really focuses on that. And I'm just passionate about how we support our humanity in getting to know ourselves as well as getting to know others. And a big piece of my work is focused on, helping parents think through how to engage in those conversations. And again, going back to the earlier question, a lot of us grew up in homes where it was like the pink elephant is really huge and no one talks about it. And we're living in a time period in this century where we can't afford not to talk about the pink elephant anymore. And that, if for many adults, is a challenge. And really thinking through, how do I talk to my kids about race and equity and inclusion in ways that I have never had conversations about that, regardless of my race or my ethnicity or where I grew up. There are different ways in which families talked about or didn't talk about those things. And how do I ensure that I don't repeat some of the cycles? Some of the information, I often refer to it as cultural tapes. Like, we all have cultural tapes embedded in our brain, information that was stored from our experiences that informs our thinking and perceptions about others, and as well as ourselves. And as a consultant and educator, I really work to try to help us identify that, and not to shame or blame people for thinking what they think, but just understanding where it came from. And then how do we re-record it? How do we go over and erase and put new information about what you learned about different groups? So my work really looks at how do we do that. If you grew up in a passive-aggressive home that avoided conflict, how do you help your child deal with that when that is a part of your own communication style and the way in which you grew up? You got to get some new skills as an adult to be effective in a way in which you do that differently in your home now than it was when you grew up. That's a big piece of my work.
Well, I think in general, people who have studied kind of ideological models of adolescent risk problems, so I study addiction, I think that they have informed the field of prevention a lot. I think the work on parenting has guided a lot. There's a lot of parenting interventions to prevent adolescent substance use and to treat adolescent substance use disorder. And I think that's been very nicely guided by the ideological models. A lot of people in intervention think of their interventions as experimental manipulations to test ideological models. So I think they go together really well. And we've worked with some of the prevention studies, probably maybe more of our work on smoking, to design prevention programs. So I think we were one of the first people to talk about the false consensus effect and kids misestimating how common smoking was, and kids who do that are more likely to smoke, and then this sort of normative feedback and correcting misperception and normative feedback has been fed back into a lot of preventive interventions. And so I think things like that, where you find a phenomenon that is predictive of developing a problem and then try to work on an intervention that might correct that risk factor.
So my research is really focused on understanding the process of parenting and how that's related to youth outcomes. And by youth outcomes, I mean things like substance use and delinquency, and also health outcomes, how it's affecting kids' stress responses physiologically. And so my work's looked a lot as parenting, what types of parenting act as risk factors or protective factors for youth outcomes, and what aspects of parenting can really help prevent later problems in terms of substance use addiction or long-term criminal behavior. I think a second area of my research has looked at stress in families, how parenting may act as a stressor for kids. So for example, how does parenting affect kids' biological stress response systems? And we've done some interesting work looking at how positive and negative experiences with parents are really linked to important physiological changes in children themselves. We've also found that parenting can be a really important buffer against stress in other domains. So we've done some work looking at stressor reactivity and found, for example, that adolescents have physiological responses to stressors in their lives every day, but that when they have a warm parent-child relationship, it can really buffer the effects of these stressors, so that stressors don't have as big of an effect on their stress-related physiology, which we measure in some cases by the hormone cortisol. So my work's really looking to understand how parenting is related to these outcomes. I think the third part is more of a new line of research for me, which is trying to understand what predicts parenting behaviors and to try to understand parents' cognitions and parents' stress and influences on the actual behaviors that they're doing with their children. So I think my work sort of helps inform interventions in that, we have a great set of evidence-based, family-based interventions now, especially in the fields of prevention science. There are several studies that have now shown really important effects on things like preventing substance use, and they've been shown their effects in some pretty rigorous trials. But I think even the strongest programs that we have still have relatively small, moderate effect sizes. And what that really tells me and lots of practitioners is there's room for improvement. So even though we've made a lot of progress in developing interventions, we may need to keep trying to understand parenting, keep trying to understand important risk and protective factors within the family that might help us enhance and improve the effect sizes of some of our interventions.
What is new about adolescents today that may call for new or revised parenting theories?
So the one thing that we have been thinking about in our lab, and I think we ended up talking about a fair amount in this special issue, in this series, although interestingly it didn't end up a paper, is technology. So I think that younger kids have access to their parents' devices, but it's still fairly well supervised. And I think as parents sort of are helping adolescents navigate things like school and peers and pressure, that's just compounded by social media and all of the information coming at them from different directions, people's opinions coming at them from different directions, influences that I think just proliferate when they get to adolescence.
The uniqueness of it goes back to thinking about how those external environmental influences enter into the life of the adolescent much earlier than we had originally, than we're really positioned to think about, because of the way that we structure our understanding of parental influences on adolescents. For example, we oftentimes use Brofman-Brennan's theory, particularly when we're talking about how parents are able to buffer those external environmental influences, direct impact on their children, because the theory is based on the notion that all of these external influences are filtered through the parents. When children are exposed to environmental influences that really is indirect, that directly influences them, wherein their parents have no idea nor ability to control what happens to them, particularly around their exposure to new media, then that's a part of the process that I'm not sure we have begun to grasp with or able to measure in an efficient way, but it is changing the way that children's development emerges.
Wonderful.
So I think particularly in the study of culturally diverse families, it's really, I think for a lot of kids, they really start to understand and recognize social inequality, racial inequality, and sort of how the cultural processes of their particular group may differ from sort of larger mainstream values. And so that negotiation, I think, is really important to understand. Kids are exposed to more diverse contexts. People, from the transitions from elementary to middle to high school, you tend to get into more and more diverse contexts, particularly then if you go on to college. And I think that exposure promotes this renegotiation of sort of some of these ideas and just the cognitive development that happens as well in terms of understanding sort of larger societal factors. And so I think that makes this a very important time frame to understand how families negotiate that transition, and is very different than earlier in childhood when kids maybe are more protected. A lot of people also don't engage in conversations with their kids about inequality till they hit adolescence. So I think that's another key piece that makes it different. I'm not saying that that's necessarily a good thing to do, but that's when parents do start initiate more of these kinds of conversations. And as we're going to talk about in the presentation we were doing today, I think how people are coupling together and how families are being formed is also is starting to be different than it has been in the past, and really understanding the racial ethnic dynamics of that. We have a lot more multicultural families, and how is that going to be resolved in terms of how parents raise their kids with those values that they hold?
Yeah, so I think parenting teenagers is different than parenting younger children, and older children for that matter, in young adulthood, because the demands are different. So adolescents are increasing in their autonomy, and they can navigate their worlds with a little bit more independence. And then that also changes the involvement of a parent. So the parent has to balance their desire to help their kid explore the world and see new things and have new experiences, but also to keep them safe. And so I think that really parenting in adolescence is all about finding that balance and a fit for your kid. And that's different than childhood, when really the parent is the driver of what needs to happen in terms of keeping kids safe and on a good developmental course. And really young adulthood too is a similar dynamic where you have to negotiate this autonomy granting and support, but not too much, and not too much over involvement, but to a bigger degree, because really the expectations for autonomy are greater.
There are a couple things that come to mind, I think, that might make parenting adolescents unique. One is a historical aspect in two respects. So one is that the period of adolescence has been extended for a longer time developmentally. So historically, people went more quickly from childhood to adulthood, but now there's more of a protracted period between childhood and adulthood. And so this is reflected in longer times that adolescents continue to be dependent on their parents financially and otherwise, with many adolescents still continuing to live at home with their parents, and even if they're not living at home, to be connected in ways technologically that were not as possible or common in the past. And so I think that that's had some implications for this extension of a relationship between parents and adolescents moving into early adulthood that is more protracted now than was in the past. I also think historically another big change that parents of adolescents are facing now compared to in the past historically won't come as a surprise, but has to do with technology also, in terms of monitoring and navigating how their adolescents are using technology with their friends. And so this becomes a major issue in parent-child or parent-adolescent relationships, speaking both as a developmental scientist and a parent of 2 adolescents, this is a really salient issue that involves it's a potential source of conflict between parents and adolescents. It's a potential source of worry. And I think that generations of parents now are facing a lot of new issues and concerns related to technology and social media use that parents in the past didn't face.
It's interesting you say that, and I've shared in the midst of dealing with adolescent in my home and watching them grow up and realizing as a parent, there's a new level of skills that I have to develop at this point, engaging more on a cognitive, emotional, social emotional way in which I didn't have to do when they were 5 or 6. So there are things that teenagers it's a different energy, whereas when they were younger, it was more physical energy. Now it's more mental energy. And thinking through how does that impact our engagement with a teenager in ways that it didn't when they were 6 or 7 or 3. And from a parental perspective, it's almost like this little person that you talk to like a child, you're now able to have mature conversations. And how do you do that? Developmentally, they're in the midst of puberty and trying to have mature conversations. So as a parent, that is very different, and it's unique in a way that their skills as parents that we're having to up in being able to relate to this person, and developmentally their physical, social, emotional, cognitive development is at a different place, and kind of intertwine puberty in that, and their hormones and their experiences of anger, frustration, and sadness are increased, and that is a higher level of engagement from a parent perspective, and being able to understand the person that you dropped off at school may be different than the person you pick up in the afternoon, and how do you reconcile that, and how do you be with them? And that's very different than any of the other developmental phases. I see that on a professional level, working with families and talking with families, as well as in my own home.
Yes, I was thinking a lot about that one actually, because adolescence is unique in a lot of ways, but I'm not sure. I think in some ways, the same parenting challenges emerge at different developmental stages reworked. So I think, when you think about adolescence, you classically think about independence and separation, because that's what you think about. But you see those in 2-year-olds. And, I've been very, very influenced by Diana Baumrinn's decades-old analogy that she always talked about the 2-year-old who wants to go up and down the stairs by themselves, and how does a parent scaffold independence and risk. And I actually think it's the same developmental challenge in adolescence, but just worked out differently in different arenas. But I think 2 things that have affected adolescence recently that may make it different, one has been economic with the recession. So the kind of difficulty launching and boomeranging back, and parents having to negotiate autonomy and independence with later family formation and maybe more hanging around the house, more, again, multi-generational households longer. So I think that that's a challenge. The other one I think of, and I'm not sure if it's affected parenting, but I'm fascinated by it, is the one where adolescents are more expert than their parents. So you've studied that with Mexican American families. But in terms of translating and being the caretaker to the world, but I think of it, of course, about technology and social media. So we think about parental authority often coming because adults are more expert and competent and need to teach the younger generation. But in technology, we pretty much have an arena where the adolescents are more competent than their parents. And I'm sort of interested in whether that plays out. I haven't seen any data to suggest that it does. Maybe it doesn't, but I'm interested in it.
Okay, so I think there are a couple of ways that adolescence is a really unique developmental period, and ways that it's fundamentally different than other developmental periods that we might encounter. So the first is, I think one of the big developmental tasks of adolescence for youth is to become their own person and develop a sense of autonomy and independence and individuate from their parents. Now this is really different
than any other developmental phase, and it requires parents to adjust and adapt in some pretty big fundamental ways in which they really have to change all the roles in their families in ways that allow these adolescents to have more autonomy and independence. And I think, of course, adolescents can't always handle all of that too soon. So I think parents struggle sometimes to find that balance between knowing what kind of structure and supervision an adolescent might need, and at the same time knowing when to sort of pull back on that structure and supervision and let kids have more freedom, more independence, things that are really important in helping them develop that sense of autonomy. And I think there's a tension there that can really be challenging for parents and for adolescents, and something that over time eventually gets worked out in most families, but I think can be a little bit of a rocky adjustment for some. So I think the first, again, is this individuation and autonomy seeking that we see in adolescence that we really don't see in other developmental periods. I think relatedly, the second thing that makes adolescence so unique is just the vast array of changes that are happening pretty much in every domain of an adolescent's life. So we see changes going on biologically, we see changes going on cognitively, we see changes going on socially. Adolescents look different, talk different, think differently, behave differently, hang out with different kinds of people, have stronger peer influences. Just dramatic amount of change. And I don't think there are other periods where we see change in so many different domains so quickly in a short period of time. And I think this has really important implications for the family because, again, and a lot of times we may see family systems are relatively stable before adolescence, but once we start seeing all these changes happening, and autonomy seeking, biological changes, emotional changes, we start to see really a disruption possibly in that family system where all kinds of behaviors, all kinds of boundaries, all kinds of roles need to shift. And I think because of this, adolescence just has that potential and really forces people to change fundamentally in their interactions with their children in a way that's really different than other developmental periods.
One thing that has really changed for adolescents and for the parenting of adolescents is the change over time in how families look and the structure of families, and also just the fluidity of families. So adolescents today have a greater chance of either currently or in the past having lived with a single parent or cohabiting parents or a biological parent who's in a relationship with another adult who's not their biological parent. In addition, adults are more likely to be having children with multiple other adults, so we call that multi-partnered fertility. And that means that there'll be ties outside of a given household. There'll be ties to other households and families. Families are spread across households. So it really changes the experience of adolescence. It changes how parents might interact with their adolescents, knowing what they've been through in terms of transitions if adults in their life have moved in and out of their household, or just kind of managing family ties across different households.
What should developmental scientists do next to better understand how best to parent adolescents today?
And I honestly don't think I have the answer to this, and it may be that everyone who sits in this chair says the same thing, because we kept circling around in our group about whether we had all the theories we needed, and it just is sort of where we just need to apply them to new stressors and pressures, or whether we actually needed new theories or constructs. And my hunch is, I think I would go with the middle ground and say we need to use the theories that we already have more flexibly to think about parenting adolescents in sort of an increasingly diverse and technological world.
One of the areas I think we're missing is integrating the role of social media and the web-based access and how it's impacting not only how parents are able to monitor their children, but to recognize that the children have access to an external environment way much earlier than we had originally thought. And currently we focus a lot on peer relationships and how peer relationships begin to be an important part of children's development or adolescent development when they reach critical developmental stages. But we know that children or young people have access to the internet much earlier than adolescents. So the question would be, how are we capturing that aspect of their world and environmental influences in our current way of studying parenting and its influence on adolescent development? And I view this as we're raising children in a world without borders. So it's not just individuals whom parents would be able to know, because some of the questions we ask in monitoring is, do you know who your children or your children's friends are? Do you know who they are? Well, it's impossible to know who they are when children are on so many new media platforms, and that these individuals really do influence their lives. And I'm not sure that our theories are situated in a way that it's mobile enough to begin to capture historical changes that's happening, and the extent to which our current measures are adequately assessing the reality of the lived experiences of adolescents living in this new media age.
That's great.
Yeah, so the perspective that I've taken a lot is really understanding ethnic cultural diversity and how cultural processes influence parenting processes and child and parent interaction. So I think there's been a lot of really good work that was done to really set some theories forward in understanding the development of ethnic and racial diverse youth, primarily Garcia Cole's model, the PVEST models, just a lot of really good models just to think overall about how contextual factors influence development, particularly for ethnic minority youth. But I do believe that we could push a little bit more around the parent and family dynamics around particular family groups, whether it be Latino or African American or Asian American, and within those different domains and intersectionality. I really think that a lot of this work has focused primarily on low-income populations due to the disparities in income in the United States, and I think there could be more work to be done to really think about that within group diversity and more fully understand sort of how other aspects of SES, of immigrant status, of phenotype, of families' educational attainment, of just other aspects influence how those processes unfold.
So I think we know a lot about parenting adolescents and what types of parenting competencies are helpful during the adolescent period. However, what we know less about is maybe how the demands of parenting have changed today, where kids and parents can interact with more frequency through things like mobile phones and other digital technologies, and maybe in kind of different ways. So perhaps like more knowledge of your kids' behaviors through things like trackers or monitoring their online presence. And so we don't know that much about that. So I think that's definitely something we need to understand better, but I'm not convinced that it's necessarily distinct from what we already know. So I think something we need to research more and get a better handle on is whether or not, say, monitoring today, where there are new tools to do so, is really that different than monitoring even 20 years ago. Maybe it's just quantitatively different. You can do it more, but perhaps the same principles that have always guided monitoring, like respecting your child's autonomy and doing it in a developmentally appropriate level, are still important. So I think we need to figure that out.
So I think that what's missing in my mind in the study of parenting of adolescents in terms of theories is what might be theoretically different about parenting adolescents versus children. So what's mostly happened in the field, I think, is that studies of parenting have followed theoretical frameworks that were developed to account for parent-child relationships, and these may or may not fit well with parent-adolescent relationships. So attachment, for example, is one of the leading relational theories that was developed to account for parent-infant relationships. So people have tried to extend that even up to adulthood. And there are a lot of things that make sense about that attachment relationships don't necessarily have to be between parents and infants, but could also be between peers or significant others. And certainly parents of adolescents need to be attached to them and have adolescents be attached to their parents. But the ways that parents would show responsiveness and sensitivity to adolescents are likely quite different from how parents would show responsiveness and sensitivity to infants. And I don't think it's always been crystal clear theoretically what sensitive parenting or responsive parenting looks like in adolescence that might be different from early childhood or infancy. And so if there's not a clear theoretical framework guiding that, then it makes empirical studies less theoretically grounded. And this is something that's often regarded as a limitation, I think, of studies of adolescence, more so maybe than with studies of early childhood. There's not as clear a theoretical framework to hang the empirical studies on.
That's perfect. Will you close that door?
Sure.
Do you want me to do quicker soundbite kinds of things rather than like go on and on for a
No,
long time?
it is fine because we can
You'll
chop it
just
up
edit
later.
it.
It's fine.
Okay.
I mean, you can also soundbite if you want to.
Okay.
But
Well, there's a lot of work that goes into looking at talking to kids about sex, sexual risky behavior, eating disorders, and those things you see more of than you see around understanding communication styles, parental communication styles. There's self-efficacy. I've seen things around that, different parenting styles, but really having parents evaluate their own communication style and how that directly impacts how they talk to their kids. I was just having a conversation with one of the professors here doing research, and she's, how do we talk to kids about bias? How do we give them tools? And I said, well, first of all, as a parent, how do we deal with bias? Do we talk about it when we experience it, or what conversations have we had? And if you haven't had those conversations, it'd be really tough to talk to your child about it. So research data that supports what are the best ways to get into those conversations as it relates to cultural identity, cultural competence. What are we exposing our children and particularly teenagers to that helps them think about what are they experiencing and how do they respond. In addition to, there's a high level of anxiety in this generation around success in academics. And how are we helping, as parents, how are we helping them cope? What coping skills are we doing? And I've had a couple conversations with parents around this. We're a generation, and I say we, a generation of parents who are co-pilots, not helicopter parents. And we are in this with them, like helping them navigate, sitting next to them, piloting, co-piloting, if you will. And in some instances, there's a time where we need to not be in the cockpit with them. They need to learn how to pilot themselves. And if there's work that looks at how do we help our children build resilience from a distance and not right in there with them. And I haven't seen a lot. And a lot of it, I think, is that we're just starting to get into this generation where they don't have a lot of experiences of failure. And how do they handle that? And really looking at, what are some strategies of providing safe failure, if that even is a term. And as parents, how we are generationally now eliminating all fail. Like we don't allow them to experience it because we're going to take care of it for them. And then we've got a generation of adults who have no resilient skills and grit in terms of, I'm having a crisis, how do I solve it? Because I've never had to do that before, and I'm 21. That would be helpful.
So I guess one of the things that I've been thinking about and tried to do a little bit of work in is thinking about how the developmental status of the kid relates to the developmental status of the parent. So, given that there are pretty systematic ages in which there's a lot of variability, but still systematic ages in which people have kids. So when your kid reaches adolescence, maybe you're reaching midlife. Well, there are things that go on with that. I think actually one of the things that's interesting about thinking about parents is thinking about the developmental challenges that parents have as parents and adults. And I think bringing that together. So the little bit of work I've done on that has been on sandwich generation families. Because one of the things that faces midlife parents is that their own parents are aging. And so trying to figure out how you're caretaking two generations. I think that is something, just thinking broadly, multi-generationally, developmentally about parenting, I think is an interesting one. And then, the others we've talked about a lot in the parenting group, the science of parenting group, is the really broadening of what a family is and the demographic changes. So, I think that's going to be a challenge. Methodologically, what we were just talking about bringing parenting more into the natural environment, like how do we study parenting in the natural environment? And you guys are doing that already amazingly well. But I don't think there's much in the literature about it. So I think that's something we have been missing, but I think we won't be missing it for much more.
What advances would you like to see in developing theories and related research in the study of parenting adolescents? What are we missing?
So when I think about what we need to work on and developing in the field of parenting adolescents, I think of 3 different things. The first, I think we need to think more about what is it that predicts parenting itself? What are the kinds of supports that parents might need? How do things like parents' cognitions and their contexts affect their ability to use effective parenting practices? I think that we understand somewhat about how parenting affects youth outcomes, but less about what actually helps parents or makes parents behave in a certain specific way. So for example, we did a study recently where we looked at parents' efficacy beliefs or their sense of control over their lives and their social support, and how this was related to parenting practices, specifically warmth and discipline. And we found that some factors affected certain types of parenting, while other factors affected others. For example, warmth was really affected by social support that parents have, especially for moms, whereas discipline was really more affected by efficacy beliefs or how much parents feel in control over their lives. And this really helped us think about, as a people in clinical practice, when they're thinking about working with families, what are the goals, what part of the parenting, range of parenting behaviors is someone struggling with, might help us try to identify appropriate things to target for working with them. And because we found such important gender effects, it can also help us understand who we might want to be targeting in interventions to help improve parenting practices. So I think to really improve some of our interventions, we need to understand more what is it that's happening in the parents themselves that helps predict these parenting behaviors. I think the second important thing that I've started thinking about, and I know others are as well, is thinking more about parenting as a dynamic process. So I think lots of times we think about something like parental warmth or parental discipline as something that is relatively a trait maybe, or something that you can capture at one time point. We ask people things like, how warm was your parent towards you in the past month? And I think there are more and more studies now showing that actually parenting varies a whole lot, and it's really this dynamic process. And if you look at something like parenting across time, there are more and more daily diary studies, and what we're finding in some of them is that something like parental warmth that we think of maybe as like a trait, parents are warm or they're not, actually varies a whole lot across the day. In fact, there's more variance within days and between days when it comes to something like parental warmth. And further, we have several studies that have tried to get at that variability and have found that parents who fluctuate a lot or who are really different from themselves tend to have kids who are more likely to engage in risky behaviors. So there may be something about variability, we call this lability, in parenting behaviors that might be important to capture and to think about how it relates to youth outcomes as well. So in general, thinking about parenting more as a dynamic kind of process rather than more of a static measure that may be something we can get at with global assessments. I think we need to expand that. The third, and this is really related to the last one I said, has to do with understanding within-person processes. So again, especially with the use of EMA data and daily diary data, we're starting more and more to think about how do people differ from themselves. A lot of our studies do between-person analyses. For example, looking at how on average people who engage in a certain type of parenting behavior are linked to average levels of some type of outcome in children. And we're finding more and more that it's important to also look at that within person level to really get at how is it that someone differs from themselves on a particular day, how that's related to a child's behavior on a particular day. And this helps us really understand what's happening to a person more than understanding average effects across a population, which are important, but also shed light on some different kinds of processes.
We hope the work of our group challenges researchers and those who serve parents to think about new ways to help parents and youth navigate the world today. They deserve nothing but our best.